All right, welcome everyone. This is another lecture on the book of Genesis. Specifically, we'll be looking at the fall in the garden, the story of Adam and Eve and the original sin. I'll also be taking a different look at this very famous and popular story by discussing a little bit its impact and the tradition of this story in later literature, specifically Jewish literature and also in the New Testament. So when we're thinking about the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden, this is this story that starts in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. This is another creation account that emerges in this two-part creation stage. In other words, in Genesis 1, we do have the story of God creating the heavens and the earth. We see God creating male and female in the image of God. And then that's where the first creation story ends with Sabbath on the seventh day, God resting. When you turn to Genesis chapter 2, we have another different story that talks about God creating Adam first from the dust of the ground. Here, we do not see God speaking creation into existence. Instead, it's a little bit different. God forms humanity from the ground and kind of breathes life into the first man. And so you see a God who's like has his hands in the dirt. He's working the field. He's there kind of perhaps in some ways as the first gardener. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, and also in verses 15 through 25, Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden, and God warns him of the dangers of disobeying. And we also see Eve emerging as a subsequent creation. And this is the passages here in Genesis 2, verses 8 through 9. The Lord planted a garden towards the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground, the Lord caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then in verses 15 through 17, it says that the Lord took man and put him in the garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. The Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of from it, you will surely die. Here you find Adam. He's placed in the garden to cultivate God's garden and to name all of the animals that God brings to him. This is further discussed in verses 19 through 20. But God also finds something different. That yes, God created the garden, yes, God created all the animals, and God created Adam, but there is still something missing. Uh, God also found that it was not good for man to be alone, and so he created Eve from the side of his flesh. This is in verse 18 and verses 21 through 20 through 25. When we get to Genesis chapter 3, there's also this new plot in the story because now you have the introduction of a particular figure or animal. It's the serpent. In Genesis chapter 3, it says that the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord had made. And he said to the woman, did God say you shall not eat any tree of the garden? Now, notice right away what we have here in this story. It's a serpent that talks. So you have this talking serpent that is there in the garden. And it actually catches perhaps Eve off guard. And she doesn't really seem surprised that there's another animal speaking to her in her language. Now, it is also interesting how the serpent seems to know about what God had said and what God's commands were. It's almost as if, creation itself was listening and was there in the stage as God placed Adam and spoke to Adam, and creation itself is also listening and watching all of the scene unfold. And so when the serpent says, like, you shall not eat any tree of the garden, this is kind of also partially true, but we could also notice that it does raise doubt, not on one tree, but all the trees in the garden. What we find here in this story is this serpent. Now, the serpent is not described as being evil or good or anything. He's just a serpent that's asking questions. But within later Jewish tradition, this serpent is eventually identified as Satan. So we see in the Book of Wisdom, this is a Jewish text that's in the from the I think of first century BC, where it makes mention of this serpent as the devil. It says Wisdom 2:24 says, by the envy of the devil, death entered the world, and they who are allied with him experience it. So here it starts to describe the death entering into the world, which is allusion to the story here in Genesis, how death enters into the world through the devil. Or in Revelation 12:9, it says the huge dragon, and this is in the book of Revelation, New Testament, this ancient serpent. So you get the dragon, the serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, Diabolos and Satanas, who deceived the whole world, was thrown to the down to the earth, and its angels were thrown down. See how here you have this interesting development of this little serpent in a garden. Which, by the way, if you were ever are hiking or out in the mountains and you see a serpent, it's kind of like whoa, they catch you off guard. And so when you see here in the book of Genesis, is actually Satan appearing here within this story as a serpent. Uh-oh, I got my little booger back there. Yeah, give me 4 minutes. Okay?
Okay, can I get chips?
Yeah, go ahead, get the chips. All right, close the door.
I'm excited.
I'm in my meeting. All right, go.
Talking to any people, I can't see them.
I know, because I'm in the meeting. All right, computer's not. I'll see you. Close the door. All right, love you. So here we got this story of Satan. He starts to appear in early Jewish literature, but here Satan is not like the devil yet. He's just a serpent. He's just this garden serpent that's just there in the background of the story and emerges as a character in Genesis chapter 3. And then we find also in Job chapter 1, verse 6. Again, notice there's like by the time we get to the New Testament, it's the dragon, the devil, this ancient serpent. And that's when you get to the book of Revelation. But when you're looking at Genesis, it's just this little serpent. And then when you're looking at the book of Job, there is this mention of Satan as almost in a sense as an angel coming before the presence of God and asking questions. Again, this is in Job 1:6, where it says, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So notice how Satan emerges. He's there in the throne room of God, and he's there talking to God and everything like that. He's not really characterized in Job as this evil person. He's just this adversary, the one who's just asking questions. Or also in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1, it says, then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. So notice how Satan, even within the book of Job or the book of Zechariah, is just figure. He's this heavenly divine being that has access to God. And he is there in the throne room of God, accusing people. And so you see within, prophetic literature, you see within wisdom literature that Satan really is this entity there, but he's not this person with these horns and tail, like the way we see portrayed in literature or movies today. He's an adversary. But it's not until much later in the New Testament where this Satan figure or this devil figure really becomes personified as an evil entity. So the snake, going back to the garden in Genesis, the snake leads Eve and Adam to doubt God's prohibition. So the serpent says, you won't really die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open. There's an assumption here that having knowledge is what makes a person divine. The prohibition, on the other hand, seems to place a limit on human knowledge. And so when God says you can eat of anything except for this, it goes to show that there's a limit to human knowledge, a limit to human awareness. But here, this desire to disobey God is also a desire to be like God, as if we weren't already created in God's image. So, this knowledge of good and evil did not make them like gods, but it did bring them a sense of self awareness, which set them apart from all the animals. So, after they were deceived and took from this fruit, which, by the way, is not an apple, I know it's kind of appears like that within popular culture, but it's a fruit. It's a fruit. And so, when they took of this fruit, they were deceived. They thought that they were going to be like God, um, without realizing that they already were created in God's image. But they thought that they were going to be like God, and that never happened. In fact, their eyes were open, they became self aware, and they realized that they were naked. And they sewed leaves together and they made themselves aprons. Now, keep in mind, if they disobeyed God, death was supposed to be the result of eating from the forbidden fruit. However, they did not immediately experience death. Instead, what we see is that God curses the snake, Eve, and also Adam. And so, what we see within this Garden of Eden story, this fall of Adam story, is this transition from an Edenic state of humanity to that of a curse and hostility. And everyone is impacted. The snake is cursed, the woman experiences also judgment, and so does Adam. So, you can see within the Genesis account how God addresses all three. And so the condition of humanity overall is understood as punishment for disobedience. As a result of sin and disobedience, as a result of this, no one got away or anything, including the snake, the serpent was also cursed. So the theology of the fall in the Garden of Eden is assumed to emerge from this story. But another way of thinking about this consequence of sin, not as a fall, but as an expulsion. There's this expulsion, and there's also this fear of God's presence. Because this is the natural result of Adam and Eve. In Genesis 3, verses 8 through 9, it says, when they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God. And God calls out to the man, where are you? Can you imagine all the questions that God is asking within this chapter? Where are you? Who said that you were naked? What have you done? God asks. In this chapter, God is asking a lot of questions. And so he's there, Adam and Eve hiding. So this is like the immediate results. Like sin makes us hide from God, makes us uh, um, turn away from God out of our shame and guilt. Then in Genesis 3:23 to 24, it says the Lord sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So an expulsion is the consequence of sin. They're expelled from the Garden of Eden. Now, this is crucial in many ways because when you're thinking about the fall of Adam, what you see is that because they disobeyed God, they were no longer suitable to live on the land, on the garden. And so the consequence of their sin was be expelled from the garden. We see expulsion and exile as a key biblical theme throughout the entire Old Testament, where exile or expulsion is actually the consequence of sin. So, whenever the Jewish people And like in Israel or Judah, when their kings and everyone they rebelled or were sinful or worshiping other gods, what did God do? God brought the Syrian Empire to conquer Israel and expelled them. They were deported to Assyria. And then much later, when you're looking at the prophetic literature, Book of Jeremiah and others, the Babylonians conquer Judah, and then what happens? They are exiled. So you get the stories of Daniel, you get the stories of Esther, you get the stories Ezra and Nehemiah. These are people that are living in a post-exile context where they're out there and serving in Nebuchadnezzar's courts or in the court of Cyrus, the Persian. So you see these stories of the exiles of or Ezra and Nehemiah, they're coming back from exile. They're returning to the land. And so this notion of God expelling or driving them out from the promised land that we see in Kings and First Kings and also in the prophetic literature, it actually has its roots here in the book of Genesis with God expelling Adam and Eve from the garden. So although we look at Genesis as like the fall of man, that is really a fourth century Augustinian way of thinking about sin. Comes much later in early Christian theology in the fourth century after Christ. But if we're looking at it back within its context, in the literary canonical context, you see expulsion appearing a lot in the Old Testament. And it is a way of cleansing the land from those who have polluted the land. So that's why expulsion does occur in the Garden of Eden, because here you see that Adam and Eve, because of their sin, are unable to live in the land. They have to be removed from the land because they have polluted themselves and therefore are polluting the land, and they need to be exiled from the land. Strikingly, in the book of Revelation, you don't see an expulsion. You have the reverse. It's a migration to it's a migration to the new city of Jerusalem. So in the book of Revelation, the prophet, the seers, John says, come out from her, all of you who are in Babylon, because there is this heavenly Jerusalem that is coming down. So and although the book of Genesis begins with an exile from the Garden of Eden, the book of Revelation ends with the migration of God's people back into the new Jerusalem, the city of God. So exile, this migration, this expulsion is in the beginning of the Bible, and it actually ends with migration into the new Jerusalem. So you see these themes of migration that are like the capstones to the new Old and New Testament. And so when we're thinking about the theological implications of the Garden of Eden, the story has provided this concept of original sin, and this is also important. So this is I'm not trying to say that this theology of the fall or anything like that is not important, but there's also other ways of looking at the story. So this concept of original sin is a belief that after Adam, all human beings are born into a state of sin. This also emerges within Jewish literature. Within Romans chapter 8, it makes mention that by one man's disobedience, many were made sinners. Or in fourth Ezra chapter 7, verse 118, it says, "O Adam, what have you done? For though it was you who sinned, the fall was not yours alone, but ours also who were your descendants." Or in the book of Second Baruch, verse chapter 54, verse 15 and verse 19 where it says, "For although Adam sinned first and has brought death upon all who were not in his own time, Adam is therefore not the cause, except only for himself. But each of us has become our own Adam." So notice how the fall of Adam within early Jewish literature, fourth Ezra and second Baruch, is also being reinterpreted and understood as not just his fall and mistake alone, but also ours as well. When you look at the New Testament in the book of Romans, you can see how even Paul is understanding this massive impact, the sin of one man, how it impacted all of humanity. Now, that's how Adam is looked. So Adam never gets a clean slate. But you also do see within Jewish and New Testament literature how Eve does have this mixed portrayal within the biblical story and history. Because it is true that Eve is presented as a woman, as a mother of all living things. But then within some Jewish books, like the book of Syriac, you start to see how there's a lot of negativity around Eve and her identity. She's credited as being primarily at fault. This emerges in the book of Syriac, chapter 25, and also in First Timothy 2:14, where it starts to point to Eve as also being culpable of this. But when you're looking at all of this, especially within the context of Genesis, it's important to notice that Genesis gives us some important insights that we cannot forget. Because remember, God gave Adam the command not to eat. And this was a command that God gave Adam before the creation of Eve. So it's even before Eve came out from the side of Adam, Adam already knew what he was supposed to do and not do. In Genesis 2:16, you see God speaking and telling Adam, "You're free to eat from anything, but must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil." And then you see in Genesis 2:22 where Eve is created. And strikingly, when Eve had the fruit and ate it, she gave it to Adam. She didn't seduce him, she didn't tempt him or anything like that. In fact, Adam was probably standing there listening to the snake. And in Genesis 3, chapter 3, verse 6, it says she also gave some to her husband who was with her. He ate it. And so this is also why God places the responsibility primarily on Adam. Because yes, Eve ate the fruit, but God didn't tell Eve not to eat the fruit. God told Adam. So Eve needed to know what she was able to do or not do, and she's getting a mixed message from the serpent. And maybe Adam didn't tell her. I don't know. Get the story. The story's a little blank here, but the primary responsibility was for Adam. It was God, in fact, recognized that it was his mistake. In fact, you see this in 3:17 because you listened to your wife and ate the fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, Adam. It doesn't say commanded you all or you, Adam and Eve. It's you, Adam. So you can see how even though we see in later Jewish literature, in First Timothy as well, that there seemed to blame Eve for making this mistake. In reality, it was Adam's fault. And so this is why you get this theology of the fall. And in fact, when you're looking at the book of Romans, Jesus is described as the second Adam. In other words, where Adam failed in being disobedient to God, Jesus, as the Christ, is the second Adam who is the new humanity and actually is faithful and obedient to God all the way till his death. So this leaves us with a couple of questions for reflection. We see God asking questions. He walks in the garden. He clothes Adam and Eve from the embarrassment on how that they feel towards one another. And so already we see God acting, moving, walking amongst them. How does this activity reveal the identity of God? What does it mean to think about a God who clothes humanity um, and covers up their shame? Uh, or a God who walks in the garden and talks and asks questions. We're in Genesis chapter 3, verses 12 through 19. The characters blame various people of their mistakes. Eve blames the serpent, Adam blames the woman, they all blaming each other. What does this reveal about our humanity? What does this say about each other whenever we're confronted with something that we blame others? Or the third question, the prohibition from eating of the tree of knowledge portrays God as placing limits on human knowledge. What can we learn about God from the fall of Adam and Eve? Is there a limitation to human knowledge? Or should we pursue knowledge and learn all we can for the sake of learning? This is a very important question, especially in our age of AI and technology. Are there limitations to what we should do or not do? And in fourth question, in popular imagination, Eve is often depicted as a seductress who tempted Adam and drew him away from God and toward evil. But the image of the woman, in other words, is often fused with the image of the serpent, and humanity's woes are her responsibility. How does this popular image of Eve compare with the actual depiction of Eve in Genesis? Because as we can notice, Eve within early Jewish literature does have this negative portrayal. She's kind of accused for being at fault here. Um, but when you look at Genesis, it's not all her fault. In fact, most of the blame goes to Adam. These are just a couple of questions to make us think about this text, especially this very important story as we reflect upon the fall of Adam and Eve. And hopefully, this could stimulate your thinking and curiosity towards reading the Old Testament and understanding the theology of sin.